I am deeply honored to have been asked to deliver this Gladys Coates University History Lecture for 2009, and I'm humbled as I look at some of the scholars in the audience who have also studied UNC history. I am especially honored by Bill Powell's presence. As Jean said, when I was a brand new faculty member here almost 40 years ago, Bill allowed me to sit in on one of his North Carolina history courses. And that's where I developed a love of history, a love of the history of North Carolina and the study of history. And I am deeply honored by your presence tonight, Bill. Thank you very much. I also want to recognize a special person. My wife, Mary Ellen Bowers, has been my inspiration as well as a critical editor of everything that I have written. To write the history, I read every issue of the Tar Heel from 1893 to 1924. I examined the correspondence and archives of presidents, chancellors, deans, former faculty members, and alumni. I interviewed more than 40 faculty members and former students. Tonight, instead of skimming across 100 years of that history, I will focus on the origins of journalism instruction at Carolina, up to the creation of the Department of Journalism in 1924. My research was guided by an effort to learn what led to the creation of that first journalism course in 1909. And I assumed that it happened because of three factors. One, there had to be students who were interested in journalism. Two, there needed to be a faculty member who was interested in journalism and who was qualified to teach the course. Three, the university had to see enough value in a journalism course to divert resources from other courses. I found all three factors. The existence of a campus newspaper in 1909 is prima facie evidence of student interest in journalism at the time. And a weekly student newspaper had been published for 16 years before the first journalism course. The University Athletic Association published the first issue of the Tar Heel on February 23rd, 1893, in part to build support for athletic activities. In the 1890s, students in the Athletic Association exercised considerable control over both intercollegiate and intramural athletic activities on campus. Stories in the Tar Heel indicated that the association hired coaches, purchased equipment, scheduled games, and secured facilities. Illustrating how athletics and journalism were commingled at the time, the first editor of the Tar Heel, Charles Baskerville, was also the star halfback and manager of the football team and a chemistry instructor. Although it was published by the Athletic Association, the 4-page newspaper that appeared every Thursday devoted itself to the larger interests of the university. It was also a business venture, and it promoted itself as the best, quickest, and surest way for advertisers to reach students. The Tar Heel was not the first student publication, however. A literary magazine, the North Carolina University Magazine, was first published in 1844 and was followed sporadically by other publications with the same or similar names. Louise Wilson said the magazine's first issue was criticized because it included news items that were deemed suitable for a weekly newspaper, but not a literary magazine. Kemp Battle reported that a newspaper called the Chapel was published around 1889, but disappeared before the Tar Heel came on the scene. In 1894, a group of students who were opposed to the influence of fraternities in the athletic association started a rival newspaper, the White and Blue, but it was absorbed by the Tar Heel in 1895. Sports coverage dominated the Tar Heel in its early decades. The front page was devoted primarily to sports stories, and editorials were often about athletics. Intercollegiate football got the most attention, along with baseball, tennis, and track and field. In case you're wondering, an 1898 editorial asked why basketball had not been introduced at the university. 10 years later, in 1908, a news story reported that 20 students who had played basketball in high school had formed a basketball association and collected $18 to support their effort. That was the beginning of basketball at Carolina, which is also celebrating its centennial this year. The interest in journalism was not just an extracurricular activity, and many former Tar Heel staffers became journalists after they graduated, without formal journalism education or training. 3 members of the class of 1897 worked for major newspapers. Ralph Graves was Sunday editor of the New York Times. Ralph Folan was city editor of the Charlotte Observer, and William Bost was Raleigh correspondent for the Greensboro Daily News. Charles Phillips Russell, of the class of 1903, was city editor of the New York Call and later became a journalism faculty member. Victor Stevenson of the class of 1905 worked for the New York Evening Post and the Charlotte Observer. Quincy Sharp Mills of the class of 1906 was an editorial writer for the New York Evening Sun. The Tar Heels' editorial offices were in a storeroom near the Methodist Church on Franklin Street. The newspaper was printed in a separate location by a private company called the University Press, which has its own interesting story. 5 faculty members incorporated the University Press in February 1893. John Manning was professor of law, Francis Venable was professor of chemistry, Joshua Gore was professor of physics and natural philosophy, Richard Whitehead was professor of anatomy, physiology, and materia medica, and Collier Cobb, who was manager of the company, was professor of geology and mineralogy. The shop foreman was Zachary Broughton, who may have had a connection with Broughton and Edwards Printing Company in Raleigh. The printing operation occupied 3 rooms on the north side of the first floor of New West. In addition to commercial printing, the company printed scientific journals, university catalogs, the university magazine, and the Tar Heel. The company started with a press capable of printing a tabloid-sized newspaper, and the fact that the first issue of the Tar Heel on February 23rd immediately followed the formation of the University Press was no coincidence. Wilson said the university accommodated the University Press as a private enterprise in a campus building because it provided a convenient and inexpensive service. It also provided employment and training for students who were interested in the production aspects of newspapers. Among those students was Oscar Coffin of Asheboro, who earned 15 cents an hour as a typesetter. A member of the class of 1909, he was editor of the Tar Heel and later was editor of the Raleigh Times, chairman of the Department of Journalism, and first dean of the School of Journalism. The quotation that Coffin chose for his half page in the 1909 Yakety Yak foretold his philosophy when he headed the journalism program from 1926 to 1953. Here's to those who love us well. All the rest can go to hell. He recalled that the printing shop had 2 cases of 11-point type for the Tar Heel, German and French fonts for scholarly journals, and a Greek font for course examinations. Coffin particularly remembered the 2 cases of 10-point italic type he used to set the names of bones in a course outline for Professor Charles Magnum. The university purchased the company's assets for $2,000 on December 31st, 1899, and moved it out of New West. The expanding Department of Philosophy needed the space, and university officials were concerned about the fire danger associated with having the printing operations in the building. Printing processes of that era involved the melting of lead at high temperatures, and the interior of New West was almost entirely wood. In 1901, the university built a 1-story brick building for the university press near the current site of the Phillips Annex next to Carroll Hall. The building was called the Engine House or Printery. That makes for an interesting coincidence. The current School of Journalism and Mass Communication is near the site of some of the earliest journalistic activities on campus. It also suggests an image of Oscar Coffin gazing out the window toward the future site of a school of journalism that he could not begin to comprehend. The print shop included an old Babcock cylinder press that was powered by an unreliable steam engine connected to the nearby power plant, which stood where Carroll Hall now stands. The antiquated press was so loud that people on nearby Cameron Avenue could tell when the Tar Heel was going to press. I discovered the story of another journalistic activity on campus that has not been chronicled in other histories of the university. The Tar Heel's first issue in 1893 included a directory of campus organizations, probably to fill space. The directory listed what one would expect: the Dialectic and Philanthropic Societies and the University Athletic Association. It also included the University Press Association, an organization of students who wrote stories about the university and sent them to their hometown newspapers. University administrators supported the Press Association because the students' stories publicized the university in the absence of a news bureau, which was not created until later. Students met regularly on Fridays to receive news reports from William Cunningham Smith, an assistant in the university library, who conferred with President Edwin Alderman to assemble news for the students. I've accounted for 2 of the factors leading to the first journalism course. 1, student interest was evident in the weekly student newspaper and the University Press Association, and several graduates worked for major national and state newspapers. 2, the university was favorable to the idea of journalism courses because student journalists provided valuable publicity through the Student Press Association. The third element was a faculty member who was interested in journalism, who had some newspaper experience, and who clearly understood the importance of journalism to the university. It is easy to visualize how the 3 factors came together. The Press Association held annual banquets, often at the Old Eagle Hotel, that were attended by university leaders who wanted to show their support for the students' publicity efforts. At the banquet on February 14th, 1907, the guest of honor was Edward Kidder Graham, who was a charismatic 31-year-old faculty member in the Department of English and Dean of the College of Liberal Arts. Graham spoke to the students that night in glowing terms about college journalism, saying, quote, "The man who sees every side of life in this country and the man who has the most power in the nation today is the newspaper man," end quote. It was especially true in North Carolina, he said, and for rapid advancement and attainment of power and fame, no calling offered as much opportunity as journalism. He said the number of students interested in journalism had been growing steadily, and students saw the opportunity that journalism offered for a good life. At the end of the banquet, members of the Press Association surrounded Graham and beseeched him to teach a journalism course. Now, do I know for a fact that that happened? No, I do not. The Tar Heel did not report that, but it is easy to imagine that that is exactly what happened. Less than 2 years later, on September 9th, 1909, Graham greeted students in the first journalism course, English 16. The class was probably held in Smith Hall, now known as Playmakers Theater, because I found a letter stating that journalism classes in 1916 were taught in the old library, which is what Smith Hall was called at the time. I believe Smith Hall was used for English department classes after the library was moved to Hill Hall in 1908, and that it was the location of Graham's first journalism course. The fact that it was taught in the English department was not unusual. The earliest journalism courses were about writing, and journalism programs at other universities had similar origins in English departments. College-level instruction in journalism in the United States began in 1869 at Washington College, now known as Washington and Lee, in Virginia. The program, which was championed by the president of Washington College, General Robert E. Lee, included scholarships and internships. It lasted only 1 year, however, probably because of Lee's death in 1870 and opposition from leading newspapers. The nation's first school of journalism was founded at the University of Missouri in 1908. Graham taught the 2-credit journalism course in addition to English 3, Advanced Composition, which was a prerequisite for the journalism course. The catalog described English 16 as, quote, "the history of journalism, the technique of style, the structure of the news story, and the study of modern journals, including discussions and practical exercises," end quote. Graham was a logical person to teach the journalism course. Before graduating, he had been president of the Athletic Association, associate editor and editor of the Tar Heel. As dean of the College of Liberal Arts, Graham was in a position to respond to students' desires for a journalism course, especially because he was so well liked by students. A Tar Heel story in 1908 about his impending marriage said he was, quote, "one of the strongest men in the faculty and universally respected by the students, who recognize him as a friend and a gentleman who will give a square deal under all circumstances and a teacher of rare ability," end quote. Graham also had ties to a family of journalists in Chapel Hill. In 1900, he was a boarder with Mrs. Julia Graves in her boarding house at the present site of the Carolina Inn. One of her sons, Ralph, had graduated from UNC in 1897, had worked on the Tar Heel at the same time as Graham, and later became Sunday editor of the New York Times. A younger son, Louis, lived in the home while Graham boarded there. Louis graduated in 1902 and also worked at the New York Times, was manager of the Parker and Bridge public relations firm and worked for the New York City government. In 1921, he would return to UNC to teach journalism, run the news bureau, and start the Chapel Hill Weekly. There was another connection between the Graham and Graves families. Edward Kidder Graham married Susan Moses in 1908, and their son, Edward Kidder Graham Jr., was born in 1911. Louis Graves married Susan Moses' sister, Mildred Moses, and they raised the younger Edward Graham after his parents died. He later became chancellor of the North Carolina College for Women in Greensboro. Little is known about students in the early courses, but an editorial note in 1911 said the editors had given responsibility for one issue of the Tar Heel to students in the journalism course, who were Frank Huff, John Halliburton, Thomas Nash Jr., and Levi Brown. Brown probably took the course as a graduate student because he wrote his undergraduate thesis in 1910 about journalism at Carolina. After receiving a master's degree in 1911, Brown was a Washington correspondent for the Raleigh News and Observer, White House correspondent for the Philadelphia Record, and director of publicity for the U.S. Committee on Public Information in World War I. He later wrote for several publications, was president of Lord Thomas and Logan Advertising Agency in New York, and was public relations director of Pan American Airways when he died in 1947. When the university raised money in 1931 to build Graham Memorial Building to honor Edward Kidder Graham, Brown donated the considerable sum of $80,000. Despite their low numbers on campus at the time, women were on the Tar Heel staff, and some were probably in early journalism classes. Mary Mcrae, the first woman admitted to UNC, and the daughter of law school dean James Mcrae, was associate editor in 1898, and Hazel Holland was managing editor in 1901. Louise Wilson was associate editor in 1911, and may have been the first woman to enroll in a journalism course. Graham taught the journalism course again in 1912 and 1913. In the intervening years of 1910 to 1912, and again from 1913 to 1915, the course was taught by Professor James Finch Royster, a Shakespeare expert in the English department. Nothing is known of Royster's journalism background, but he was related to Vermont, Connecticut Royster, who graduated from UNC in 1935 and became editor of the Wall Street Journal before returning to teach in the School of Journalism from 1971 to 1986. Graham became university president in 1913, and Richard Hurt Thornton was hired in 1915, primarily to teach journalism courses, after he visited the University of Wisconsin to observe its journalism program. The UNC journalism program expanded to 4 courses in 1915, including news writing, news editing, editorial writing, and feature writing. Students who completed the 4 journalism courses and certain liberal arts electives could receive what was called a certificate in journalism. A year later, Graham enlisted Thornton and the journalism program in his public service effort to extend the boundaries of the campus to the boundaries of the state. On December 7th, 1916, 100 newspaper people from North Carolina gathered in the Dialectic Society Hall in New East for the first North Carolina Newspaper Institute, which was co-sponsored by the North Carolina Press Association. In welcoming the newspaper people, Graham said the university and newspapers needed to work together to solve the great problems of the people in both prosperous and stunted communities. The newspaper men had been invited to the university, he said, quote, not to be taught by us, but that we may be a medium through which knowledge may be spread and given to the great bulk of the people with which both newspapers and the university try to reach. Just as the university is the product of the ideas and feelings of its community, so is the newspaper, end quote. The idea of the Newspaper Institute has continued to the present day. The staff of the Tar Heel published the Press Institute News for attendees. It was the first daily newspaper published on campus, albeit for only 3 days. The United Press wire service provided national news, and a typesetting machine was provided by the Mergenthaler Company of New York. 2 global events affected journalism instruction in 1917 and 1918. The United States entered World War I in April 1917, and journalism courses were curtailed because of military activities on campus. Many students enrolled in military courses, joined the Student Army Training Corps, conducted drills and maneuvers, and practiced digging trenches in Battle Park. Some dormitories were called barracks, and the Army opened a post-exchange on campus. The Tar Heel did its part to conserve paper by reducing its type size and the number of pages from 6 to 4. The end of the war on November 11, 1918, brought an end to military activities on campus. The worldwide Spanish influenza epidemic, which began as the war ended, also had an impact on the university. More than 500 of the 1,000 students at the time became ill, but only 3 died. A 3-week quarantine of students was lifted in October as the epidemic was waning. When 2 university doctors became ill, second-year medical students helped to care for the sick. A Tar Heel editorial implored professors to open classroom windows to let in healthful fresh air. The greatest tragedy of the influenza epidemic was reported in the Tar Heel on October 30th, 1 week after the newspaper had reported that the influenza epidemic was almost over. A front-page story reported the death of 42-year-old President Edward Kidder Graham on October 26th, just 5 days after he became ill. The Tar Heel had mentioned another notable flu victim a week earlier when it reported that Mr. T.C. Wolfe, managing editor of the Tar Heel, left the Hill last week to be with his brother, reported to be very ill with pneumonia, at his home in Asheville. That referred to Thomas Wolfe's visit to his brother Ben, whose death was portrayed as the death of Ben Gant in Wolfe's novel, Look Homeward, Angel. Graham's role in the development of journalism education in North Carolina was recognized at the North Carolina Press Association meeting in 1919 in a 12-stanza poem by William Hill, which ended thusly: "Weed well his grave, here sleeps a man so true, 'tis well to honor him. So bright a gem, alas, we find so few, his fame shall never dim. And as we think of all that he hath done to build and hearten youth, we now can see the victory he won for God and man and truth." Clarence Hibbert began teaching journalism courses in 1919. Student journalists did not understand the nature of an academic department, and a news story in the Tar Heel identified Hibbert as head of the journalism department in the English department and said he was qualified because of his extensive experience as a newspaper correspondent in Japan. In offering the position to Hibbert, Edwin Greenlaw, chairman of the English department, said he would teach 3 journalism courses to 25 men 5 days a week. He also said Hibbert and his wife could rent a new bungalow in Chapel Hill for $25 a month. It had water, electricity, and a good location. Its lack of a furnace would not be a problem, Greenlaw said, because it had a fireplace and an adequate supply of pine and oak firewood. The Tar Heel was optimistic about the future of journalism instruction at the university, saying the journalism department would get permanent quarters, including a reading room in the basement of Alumni Building, as soon as the electrical department moved into Phillips Hall, the new science building. The news story read like an editorial, expressing hope for a school that would compare favorably to others in the country. It said the new department and the new School of Commerce showed that educators had responded to the demands of the times and had given young people in the state what they wanted at UNC instead of making them go out of the state. The story boasted that journalism students at UNC took only 5% of their courses in journalism, compared to 15% in the big schools of journalism in the large Eastern universities. Despite what the story said, the university had not yet created a department or school of journalism. Journalism at the university did reach a significant milestone in 1921 with the hiring of Louis Graves as head of the News Bureau and the first person to hold the title of Professor of Journalism in the Department of English. Graves, the first journalism teacher who had significant newspaper experience, replaced Hibbert, who continued to teach American literature in the English department. The student newspaper said Graves was an old Carolina man who finished school in 1902. The story said he had been a great football player and was the best tennis player in the university. One of Graves's first actions was to join the North Carolina Press Association, and he addressed the group's annual convention in Asheville on July 28th. He spoke colorfully about the role of journalism education. Quote, "The craft of newspaper writing has suffered from a vagabond atmosphere which used to surround it, and writers used to be looked upon as freaks, strolling minstrels, and drunkards who were looked upon as hanging around the fingertips of reputable society." End quote. More preparation should be given to training in journalism, he advised, and a school of journalism was the solution. Graves's News Bureau activities forced him to cut back his journalism teaching, and he compensated by assigning students to work in the News Bureau. However, he was further distracted by his efforts to start his own newspaper in Chapel Hill, which occurred with the first issue of the Chapel Hill Weekly on March 1st, 1923. The newspaper won the tug of war on Graves's time, and he resigned his university positions in 1924. University officials concluded that it would not be practical to combine both responsibilities and that a separate department of journalism was needed. With a front-page story on May 27, 1924, the Tar Heel reported that although university officials had kept a sphinx-like silence, students had heard rumors about plans to open a department of journalism for the coming academic year. The report said Gerald W. Johnson, an editorial writer for the Greensboro Daily News, had agreed to be the chairman of the department. He was a North Carolina native and a 1911 graduate of Wake Forest University who had worked at the Lexington Dispatch. When classes started on September 19, 1924, 13 students were in the basic course and 4 in the advanced course, with 5 women among the 17 students. The department was located on the 2nd floor of New West, above the student newspaper offices and below a room where the wrestling team practiced. So, 15 years after Edward Kidder Graham taught the first journalism course, journalism at Carolina reached a milestone as a separate academic department in 1924. Graham legitimized journalism education at the University of North Carolina and made it an integral part of the university's academic mission and service to the state. From that humble beginning, journalism at Carolina has grown to more than 800 students, nearly 50 faculty members, and more than 20 staff members. It is recognized today as one of the premier programs of its kind in the world. Johnson was followed by other visionaries who shaped the school as it adapted to changing demands. He was chairman for only 2 years before he was succeeded by Oscar Skipper Coffin, a legendary curmudgeon who led the department and school for 27 years. Neil Luxem came from Ohio State in 1953 to turn the school sharply to a more academic focus, including a graduate program. Wayne Danielson from 1964 to 1969, and Jack Adams from 1969 to 1979 provided continuity and stability as the campus weathered growth, racial integration, and the Vietnam War. From 1979 to 2005, Richard Cole transformed the school by expanding its programs, raising millions of dollars, and moving it to a newer and much larger home. Today, Gene Folkerts leads the school as it enters the second century of journalism education at Carolina. Thank you.
Tom has indicated he would take a few questions if there are any. Jason, would you flip the light back on, please? Thank you. You're already doing it. Good. Yeah.
Don.
Where did the women come from? Is there Chapel Hill women or so forth?
The question is, where did the women come from in the early courses? Starting with Mary Mcrae, women were admitted to the university as long as they were residents of Chapel Hill Township, which meant they had to live in the community. And the reason for that is it would be many years before the university would provide residence halls for women. Dan?
Tom, what was the biggest surprise you found, or the thing that perhaps you found you didn't expect about
The biggest surprise is something that I didn't even touch on in tonight's remarks, and that was, I think, I would have to say, was the role that an alumnus named Holt McPherson played in the school in the period from about 1945 until about 1960. He was the driving force behind getting the North Carolina Press Association to pass a resolution asking President Frank Porter Graham to seek accreditation for the Department of Journalism. Holt McPherson and the other editors knew that Skipper Coffin would never do it. Coffin had no use for accreditation. So McPherson was the force behind that. Interestingly enough, the school failed its first accreditation bid in 1948. But that led to the creation of the School of Journalism, and it also led Holt McPherson to create the School of Journalism Foundation, which began raising money and has raised millions of dollars over the years. In 1953, when Skipper Coffin resigned as dean, McPherson was a driving force behind the recruitment and appointment of Neil Luxem as the next dean of the School of Journalism. Now, I knew Holt McPherson. I had no idea of his role in all of these things. Yes, Meryl?
Was the school's evolution always sort of in a direction of growing, getting bigger, or did they face any sort of critical crises when it might go away or diminish? Or?
Well, I think the period of time in the transition leading from Coffin to Luxem, the school did not have a very good reputation on campus. Among other things, Coffin had no use for graduate degrees. And he did not have a single faculty member with a graduate degree in journalism. Now, Bob Spearman is here. Bob's dad, Walter Spearman, had a master's degree, but it was in dramatic art. Nobody on the faculty had a graduate degree in journalism, and Coffin wouldn't stand for it. Now, there was a time, the enrollment gradually increased. The enrollment of women, there were always women, low numbers at first. During the period from about 1941 to 1945, as you would expect, the percentage of women in the Department of Journalism was as high as 85% one year. So the enrollment did grow. Now, when one of the things that Luxem did when he took over was to establish and enforce rigid standards about admission. And when that happened, the enrollment did take a drop for a couple of years, but then it started back up again and continued going up.
Tom, when were the women's dormitories and things built so that we had women? By the time I came here in 1942, there were 4 women's dorms.
To call on Bill Snyder or Bill Powell or maybe John Sam. I don't know when the first women's residence halls were built.
We were on the juniors and seniors.
Right. Just
Spencer was built about 1921 or 3, but I think there were some adapted houses and so on before that.
okay. And initially, as Lois pointed out, most of the women who were admitted as junior transfer students, including some in journalism. And you were one of them, right? That's right. Don? Dan?
Go to him first.
Dan?
I'm just curious, how long have you been working on this, Tom? And did it consume every day of your life?
I maybe should ask Mary. I think it was in March or April of 2007 when Jean asked me if I would do this. At that time, the written history of the school was 2 paragraphs long. And I started by looking at the Tar Heel, by looking at university catalogs. I greatly benefited by the fact that 3 of the men who played such an important role, and that would be Coffin, McPherson, and Luxem, their papers are all upstairs in the library. And that's when things really began to take off. Initially, what I did was just to sort of give us an idea of how this took off, I was taking notes on my computer, and then I would come home and start to write what I call the narrative, which I put these things together into a story. And I had one file, one computer file called narrative, thinking I could do it all in one file. Well, pretty soon that became 2, then it became 6 chapters, and eventually it became 14 chapters. It did not consume my life. I think that's accurate to say. I mean, 1 or 2 days a week here at the library, countless hours here and there putting things together. But it took about 2.5 years of pure pleasure. Yes?
How does the narrative of the history of this school of journalism figure into other schools of journalism in the South?
I don't know, to be honest. I mean, there are other schools of journalism in the South. South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Tennessee. So there are others. Washington and Lee is still one of the really good programs. Don?
I was just going to ask one quick follow-up on Skipper. I've been around long enough to hear many stories about him. As far as you can tell, was the early skipper, the first 10-year skipper, the middle 10-year skipper, and the final 7-year skipper, was he changing?
I don't think I could answer that based on what I saw. You know, frankly, I was surprised. Skipper Coffin was sort of the anti-dean in some respects, in terms of his approach. And yet, he's got all of these records that he kept. He even made carbon copies of letters that he wrote. And he kept those letters. So I don't know. I think perhaps he changed. I don't know, there may be one or two people here who knew Skipper. I know Bob Spearman said he knew him. Did he change?
I didn't sense any change, but I don't think I really knew him in his early years.
Okay. He was a character.
He was happily curmudgeonly the whole time I knew him.
I hesitate to start telling Skipper stories. He spent a lot of time at a Chapel Hill tavern called The Shack. Anybody here remember The Shack? Some of you?
You needed to wear rubber boots.
I could say that The Shack stood down on Rosemary Street, but a better term would be it leaned. Skipper started his day there. He went into the shack, drank a beer, smoked a cigar, went to the office, went back in the afternoon, and a lot of students knew that if they wanted to talk to Dean Coffin, that's where they should find, that's where they would find him. And he encouraged that. He encouraged students to do that. So, you know, and grading, he would give grade. Jim Schumacher, a lot of you remember Jim Schumacher. I'll tell one of these stories. Jim Schumacher was a student here after World War II. And Jim had been shot down over Germany. He spent some time in a German prison camp, prisoner of war camp, so he was not really into all this academic stuff as a student. And he was also working full-time at the Durham Morning Herald. He took Skipper's editorial writing course one term. And they were supposed to write one editorial every week and turn it in. Jim didn't bother, just didn't do it. Skipper saw him one day near the end of the course and said, "Shoemaker, you owe me 10 editorials." And so Jim that night, for whatever reason, he got a conscience or whatever, Jim wrote all 10 editorials, wrapped them up neatly, tied a piece of twine around a bundle of papers. And he walked into Coffin's office the next morning and he dropped it on Coffin's desk. And Coffin said something to the effect, "What the hell's that?" And Jim said, "Those are the editorials that I owe you." And Coffin said, "If I don't have to read them, I'll give you an A." Jim picked up the bundle, dropped it in the wastebasket, and got an A. That was Skipper, the classroom teacher. John?
Back in the late 50s and early 60s, journalism school graduates were regarded very highly in the newsrooms I joined. Did that happen with North Carolina students?
If I think that what you're saying is that there was a period of time when newspaper editors thought that there was too much of an academic focus in journalism programs, that students weren't really learning how to be journalists, they were just learning about journalism. And that's one of the things I think that was true of Luxem. But Luxem was Luxem believed that there should be a strong academic focus, that it should be a strong academic basis to the journalism program. And he kind of became a national gadfly. He said there are too many schools of journalism. He said there should be fewer, and they should be academically based. Now eventually, I think that perspective finally won over. But it was true here, I think. Now one of the things that I really feel I need to be fair to Skipper Coffin after saying those other things. Skipper was loved by students. Lois told me a great story, Lois Cranford told me a great story about her first meeting with Skipper. And other students told me about similar experiences. He sometimes would have editors at his home, and he and his wife would entertain students at his home. And he would introduce them to the editor. Or he would get into his dilapidated old car and take a student and drive off to a newspaper office somewhere in North Carolina, walk into the editor's office and say, "You should hire this young person." So he endeared himself to generations of students. And when people like McPherson and Luxem came along and started raising money to support the School of Journalism, those loyal students, those loyal graduates, came up with the money. So despite what you say about Skipper Coffin, he had an important positive impact on the school. Yes?
Hi, my name is Nicole. Nowadays, a lot of students and professors maybe sometimes butt heads because that work with Tar Heel, because either you have to choose between doing a reporting assignment sometimes or doing a DTH article.
Mm-hmm.
Was there ever a time in your research that you found that the School of Journalism and Tar Heel worked together in terms
Yes.
of class?
Mm-hmm. Some of the early journalism courses, even the course description in the catalog, said that these courses are for staff members of the student newspaper. So that did happen. But by and large, the Tar Heel always retained that fierce sense of independence from the School of Journalism. There was a time in the 1950s when the Tar Heel was having trouble getting staff members, and someone even suggested that maybe the school should take it over, or at least take over the business aspects of it, but that never came about. But they were always independent of each other. But there was more cooperation at certain times.
Did the School of Journalism ever have a relationship with high school newspapers? I remember going to, I'm from Georgia, Macon, Georgia, and so at UGA, the 9th grade, 11th grade, always go for the journalism report, and we did that. So I'm curious.
It has had, going back to, I think in the 1920s, there was a time when the school did some things for high school students. Now it has a full-time staff member who does incredible things with high school journalists in the state of North Carolina.
Tom, that was excellent, and we give you an A.